The deeper back you go through the subspatial levels, the less like the original planet is, and the more UN situations there have been. Thus, E15 is a world of grey ash that settles on it from thousands of volcanoes that have broken through the surface. E14 is nothing but glassy rock, and E13 is primarily a crystalline structure these days. E12 is all jungle, and so on. Nearer to E1, the worlds are more recognisable, particularly E2, E3 and E4. E4 had it lucky. It stopped progressing just before the First World War, but it mainly consists of the British Isles and southern and eastern Europe where the rest is either wasteland or water.
Welcome friends, you're listening to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock flavoured podcast. Here in the north of England the days have shortened, the wind is biting, and we remain in what is now feeling more and more like a perennial lockdown. Nevertheless, our mojos remain intact, and we hope yours do too. It's been a funny old year, what with a worldwide pandemic, political turmoil, physical separation from friends and family, and a rapid expansion in my already well-burgeoned waistline thanks to all of the above. The show's over a year old now, and we're only a couple of weeks out from our second joint Michael Moorcock and Phil birthday show. Incredible really. It's certainly the case that as one gets older, time passes more fleetingly, but this year has been truly ridiculous in its haste. But having this show as a hobby has been a real anchor and a source of therapy. Unfortunately, it hasn't replaced my primary form, retail therapy, and my Moorcock collection grew again this week with more additions based purely upon being attracted to covers I was unfamiliar with. But, as we more radical, cultist Moorcockians know and acknowledge, this is the way. Little Star Wars gag there. On this occasion, I've picked up a couple of the Between the Wars sequence, starring unreliable narrator in extremis, Colonel Pyatt. As we're still only on the final programme with Hussein, the Colonel's yet to make his debut on the show, but I look forward to covering the first of these, Byzantium Endures, sometime soon. Like much of Moorcock's material, they're more relevant now than ever. For now though, we have a special guest co-host, and we're going to look at the broad appeal of Moorcock from the perspective of one of the great creatives of the comic world in the form of the mighty KEK-W. We'll touch on comics, naturally, but also a bit of music and a variety of other things as we are blown along by the winds of limbo. So, sit back, drop some psychedelic prog on your turntable, and join us in Derry and Tom's. And we're back in virtual Derry and Tom's with a very special guest. It's taken quite a long time for us to hook up, but we got there in the end. It's KEK-W, writer,
Hello.
Comic creator, 2000 AD Script Droid,
Yeah,
and writer of one of my favourite recent comics, Fall of Dead World, amongst many, many other things. I must say, Fall of Dead World and the black humour and the art by Dave Kendall is right up my street. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Glad you're enjoying it.
Yeah, it's awesome. And what else have you been working on recently for the Galaxy's Greatest Comic?
Oh crikey! What am I allowed to talk about? That's because sometimes you've got to wait for things to be solicited, and I'm working on quite a long lead time at the moment. So one thing I can probably talk about is I'm working on a new series of The Order with John Burns. So I've just delivered episode 9. I think John's on about number 3. So at the moment, I'm kind of outlining the last sort of furlong or so of that. I don't know when we'll see that. It's probably quite a way off, probably well into next year, autumn, something like that.
Yeah. It'll be a long, long time before I get to it then, because I haven't bought 2000 AD for a long time, but I do tend to pick up the collections. So I picked up the first collection. I think shortly after we spoke probably about 8 months ago, and I love it. But John Byrne's artwork is beautiful as well, isn't it? So it's a great combination.
It's an honour and a delight to work with him. I mean, he's one of the greats of British illustration. You know, one of the Silver Age giants, and he's still knocking it out the park now. I mean, the Americans had Kirby, Ditko, Wally Wood. I mean, we've got John and Frank Bellamy, and Mr. Lawrence, Don Lawrence as well. I think they were our big three, and John's still at it. So it's a delight to work with him.
Yeah. So before we get on to Moorcock specifically, how did you get involved in comics and writing in the first place?
Well, I've always loved comics. I think, I was in a generation where newsagents were full of the old classic weekly anthologies, Lion, Valiant, all the stuff that was out there, Hotspur, before 2000 AD came on the scene. But also I was lucky enough to live through what I would call the peak Silver Age of Marvel. So Jack Kirby and Stan Lee were absolutely on fire at that point. So as a young kid, I was seeing the really great, often quite weird British black and white strips that were coming out. And then you'd see Jack drawing Fantastic Four, Thor, Ditko's Doctor Strange, Jim Steranko. So, I had I was kind of around exactly the right time. And plus, you also got to remember, for a lot of people, this might not kind of be a reference point, but we were right in the heart of the space race back then, So every other week, the Americans or the Russians would be, putting somebody in orbit, and there were beginnings of the moon shots, peak science fiction, not to get all nostalgic, but, 2 or 3 TV channels. But Sunday afternoon, 1950s black and white science fiction drive-in films, monster movies, Universal horror films, Karloff. So really, all I had to do was just be there. And I mean, you couldn't fail but to be, soak all this stuff up, So I think it was almost a brainer that I would kind of move towards that. By the time I guess I was just round about pre-teens, early teens, I was already writing stuff, bad, terrible stuff, but sort of just spitting out short stories, and kind of didn't have a clue what I was doing, but sort of just kind of writing weird science fiction things and fantasy. And, when I was like 12, I guess, 13, I had a really good, encouraging English teacher when I was 14, Mr. Lee, at the school I was at. And whatever the assignment was, I'd somehow twist it to turn it into like a science fiction or a horror story. And he was great because he never kind of like said, "Oh, you've gone a bit off road there." He just, he was really encouraging, and he'd always write little notes at the end and little doodles. And I only had him for a year, but he was fantastic. I mean, everybody deserves a really good teacher like that. I got to tell you this very quick anecdote. One week we came in and he said, we're not going to do anything this week except you're going to sit and listen, and I'm going to read a book to you. And at the end of the week, I want you to tell me, what you thought about it, what it was about, how, your impressions of it. So we sat there for a week in English lessons, and he read A Clockwork Orange to us. So I guess I was like 13, 14, and you kind of go, holy cow, He was great. He was a really great English teacher. And of course, it's written in that weird Russian argot. So you start off going, I don't know what this means, vidi and all this, And of course, by day 2, you understand what all the slang means, and that was one of the points he made. Yeah. No, he was very encouraging. And but actually, I sort of started out as an artist. I used to draw lots of comics, cartoons, etc., etc. Even though I kind of wrote a bit as a teenager, I then spent many years drawing. Not that well. I think if I'd spent about another decade at it, I might have been competent. But in the end, I kind of came back round full circle and started writing again. And I just found it a little bit easier because I could see the images in my head. It was just kind of describing them and, making it move forward in a story.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, teachers. And I never had a teacher who read The Clockwork Orange to me, but I had a couple of teachers, one of whom had nothing to do with English, but when I was about 8 or 9 years old, in his class, he had an Eagle annual from probably the late 50s. So that was the first time I ever saw Dan Dare and Frank Hampson's artwork. And he also had a collection of the Tales of the Trigon Empire, which with that fully painted artwork, which was absolutely fantastic and really mind-blowing to like a 9-year-old. But I had another teacher who was really, really encouraging about reading and was more into things like George Orwell and Animal Farm and things like that. But we were on holiday in Spain, one of those family holidays that you have in the 80s when the Costa Brava was really popular. I think it's Costa Brava. Yeah. And we bumped into this English teacher, Neil Simmons, lovely guy, and he lent me a load of P.G. Wodehouse books because I'd read all my books in the first week. So he lent me, I think, half a dozen P.G. Wodehouse books, a couple of Jeeves, Smith in the City, a couple of other bits and bobs. So he was a super encouraging teacher. It really is priceless, stuff like that.
Totally.
So, how did you come across Moorcock?
Well, here's another long rambling story.
The ones we like.
Yeah. I've been trying to think about this, and I can't exactly nail it. But here's where I think the chronology is roughly. I would guess I was round about maybe 11, 12, and I was reading everything under the sun, fantasy, science fiction, etc., etc. Now I've got a clear memory of reading the Swords trilogy. So I suspect I may have started with that because I can remember walking home from town one day with my nose either in Knight or Queen of the Swords, literally sort of walking along Hewish, that's a street in Yeovil, sort of just unable to put, like people would be with a phone now, unable to put this book down. So I suspect maybe the first one might be Knight of Swords, but I got a feeling Final Program was floating around at school at the time. Now, when did that come out? About 69, maybe, something like that?
I think it was published as shorts in a magazine, and then it came out as a novel, I think in 68.
68.
Yeah.
And I guess the film came out early 70s, the John Finch
the Robert
thing.
Hughes film, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe they reissued the book, or because I can remember that sort of going around my classroom. So I'm a bit sketchy about, did I read Final Program first or something like Night of the Sword? But certainly the Swords trilogy stuck in my head, and then it was off reading Elric, and then finding all these other things and going, this is mind-blowing. Like they're all the same guy, at different points in time and space. I think I really liked that this interconnectedness. And because I'd grown up reading Marvel comics, Stan Lee had this integrated Marvel Comics universe where Daredevil would meet Spider-Man and the Avengers would fight the Fantastic Four. I really dug that whole thing. Hey, here's a writer who's got different characters, but not only do they know one another, but they're sort of different aspects of the same person. So I think I could really get into that.
What is it about Moorcock? What's the appeal of Moorcock? I mean, that's a pretty sophisticated classroom to be passing around the Final Program. I think when I was 11 or 12, it was The Rats by James Herbert, when we were all getting into trouble off teachers and getting them confiscated.
Well, I was going to laugh at you saying about that. That would be going around, but also sort of like a dodgy copy of Penthouse magazine might be in the back of the class. And I always remember one of my classmates around about that time, Spike Milligan, reading Spike Milligan. Yeah. What was oh God, my brain's gone dead. Not My Partner's Downfall. Before that, one of his Irish things. It was a racy comedy. Well, it was to like 12-year-old boys.
Yeah.
It'll come to me later when we finish this call. But yeah, stuff like that would be floating around. It was kind of bright, young, kind of pubescent boys with too much time and stuff on their hands, But I think we all kind of went through that, reading Lord of the Rings and finding maybe bits of it dull, and then reading Moorcock and going, holy shit, this is great. This is more vivid and modern. you could read it in a one or two fast sessions. It read like a comic book, I think, to a degree. It had that rat-a-tat-tat to it. The visuals, obviously, when I was a little bit older, you kind of look at it and go, well, that's obviously LSD or mescaline in that scene, you know, all the colors and stuff. Very, very vivid. You know, it just made Tolkien look like, I don't know, like your granddad's fantasy, as it were. You know, and also hand in glove with Hawkwind, Black Sabbath. You know, it's every young teen boy's thing, really. And it felt like it's weird because a lot of people say to me, why do you like that stuff? It's very proggy and unpunk. I kind of disagree, because a lot of my classmates later on were listening to Yes and Genesis, but that whole Hawkwind thing, it was very anti-establishment and proto-punk. And Moorcock seemed to sort of fit with that, if you get what I mean. That whole Mick Farren, you know, Ladbroke Grove, Jerry Cornelius, it all sounded really on the number, you know. It was kind of hippie-ish, but felt sharper and cooler, you know.
That's the beauty of that early Hawkwind stuff, isn't it? It's if you judge Hawkwind by some of their later output, you don't get anything like the full picture.
No, totally. Those first 5 or 6 albums, I mean, it's seminal stuff.
And I think it really was a good fit as well, because Hawkwind weren't really into doing, you know, they would never do Tales from Topographic Oceans, for example, or something, you know, kind of navel gazy and lengthy and experimental and boring. Hawkwind were never ever boring. I actually quite like a lot of Yes stuff, but
yeah, I mean, me too. Later on in life, you know, I grew to appreciate some of that more, you know, and later on I got into jazz and loved all that stuff. But as a young teen, you know, I liked the riffage of it, you know, the heavy. It felt very working class. You know, I mean, Black Sabbath were very, you know, Brummy lads. You got that vibe off of Hawkwind. They were very punky, very down to earth, countercultural. You could wrap your head around the riffs, but it was also, you know, there were spacey bits in it. It's just a perfect soundtrack. That then got me into, you know, krautrock, Amon Düül, Can, and all that sort of stuff, which felt like the German counterpart to what they were doing.
Yeah.
So very heady times, you know. I was exactly the right age for all that. And then, of course, you know, a few years later you hit punk, and that refreshes the whole thing again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your point about them being kind of short, sharp, punchy, and of course, you know, we've all heard those stories about Moorcock basically writing them in 3 days.
Yeah.
You know, and his rules how to write a book in 3 days. But I think when we covered Jewel in the Skull, my co-host for that was Natasha, and she dubbed it a one shit book. and she's not far wrong, to be fair. But yeah, so I mean, when it comes to his broader stuff, you know, outside of the Eternal Champion stuff, when we talked about it last year, we were talking about the Rituals of Infinity, weren't we?
Yeah.
And some of his 60s science fiction output was so far in advance of anything I'd ever read, and some of them are quite slight, and although they're a quick read, a couple of them haven't stayed with me at all. But things like Rituals of Infinity and is it the Blood Red Game?
Yeah.
Some of the concepts in those books have stuck with me for even though I haven't read them for 30 years.
I grabbed my copy of Rituals of Infinity earlier because we were talking about it earlier in the year, and again, I very much, it folds into that period in my life a little bit later after I was reading the science fantasy sword sorcery stuff. But the edition I read, I think, is kind of around about 74, 75. As you say, it's kind of a slight book, but I reread it earlier because I thought we'd be doing a thing about this. But I really enjoyed it. It feels like a 70s book.
Yeah.
But of course, it's a repackaging of a mid-60s one, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But rereading it, when I read it, I felt it was very much you know, on the zeitgeist when I was reading it in the 70s, and rereading it now, it feels like a 70s book. So I think you're right. It feels maybe it was 8 to 10 years kind of ahead of itself. it's hard to quantify that, but it's got a vibe about it. I mean, to us living in kind of slightly dull post World War II Britain, the idea of characters wearing T-shirts and sneakers and Hawaiian shirts. I know that sounds kind of a bit cod, but there's a kind of weird hipness to it, but it doesn't feel forced with Moorcock, I can kind of just in my head rereading it, when he's going around, sort of driving around San Francisco. It reminds me of films like The Amiga Man, driving around in the big kind of open top car around a slightly kind of post-apocalyptic city, So you've got, like, instead of Charlton Heston, it's this, I guess, like an analogue of Michael Moorcock, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Falstaff. He kind of mocks himself, describes himself being a bit overweight, and there he is in these shoddy old jeans and sneakers or shorts or whatever, and he's got the chick in the car with him, and it's but the world's collapsing, sort of that almost feels to me like climate collapse on Fast Forward, all that sort of stuff. But again, I don't know, I think this feels like stop me if if I'm wrong, because you're fresher with all this stuff than me. It's just kind of a vibe. It feels like Rituals of Infinity is a tryout for the multiverse. The fact that you've got this well in space and there's different versions of this planet of Earth, and one by one they're being sabotaged, killed by the bad guys, blowing up. But it almost feels like he's putting an idea together in his head. What if there were loads of different Earths, In this one, he kind of destroys them as he goes along. But I'm wondering if a bit later, perhaps that fed into the sort of the whole Eternal Champion thing, and all being aspects of, but on different Earths.
Yeah, it's interesting rereading all these again. When I was reading Rituals of Infinity, when we were talking about it, I'll mention what it brought to my mind in a moment. But on that subject of the multiple worlds, I think Moorcock is definitely somebody who has no problem whatsoever recycling himself and recycling his own ideas and developing them.
Totally.
And when we did the Eternal Champion a couple of months ago, one of our listeners, Simon Perrins, who done our brand and ID for the podcast and done some fantastic work, did me an amazing Jerry Cornelius commission. He pointed out that in the original short story of the Eternal Champion, which I think dates to something like 1959, the elements of the Eternal Champion are there. It's just all the names are different. So if you read the Eternal Champion novel, from the, late 60s or early 70s publication, when he's having his dreams, he's talking about Elric. He's talking about some of the names are different. He refers to Coram Mac Brannan or something, and then in later versions it's changed to Coram Halen Ersi. But in the late 60s version, it's Alexander and a whole host of other kind of made-up names. So even in the late 50s, he had this idea of the Eternal Champion.
I had no idea it'd gone back that far.
Yeah, it's amazing, really. Yeah.
I need to Google all that. So Rituals of Infinity actually is maybe more like a placeholder between that. Well, I had that idea in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's play around with this. And then in the late 60s, it starts taking shape a bit more.
Yeah. And I think he's one of those authors. He's got an idea, and he writes so prolifically and so quickly. In the 60s, it was knocking him out on the bog. He was knocking him out so quickly. So all these ideas just mature and ferment and become something new. So yeah, we found covering the Eternal Champion that we read. There's a paragraph where he's asleep and he's remembering all these names with the versions of that paragraph. The 1959 short story, the late 60s version, and the version from the latest Gollancz collection, where he's revised a lot of his stuff again. So even though he's recycling his own ideas and rewriting ideas into new books, he's revising his books as well to kind of match what he's done later on down the line as he's recycled. So trying to unpick it all, there's just no point trying. You just experience it, and you experience the epiphanies as you go along, and you make the connections as you go along. It's just, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's so rewarding reading him.
What does the 59? You said that was a short story. What's that appear in?
I think it was originally published in the magazine that he was editing or working on, which the name of which I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's in one of the Gollancz collections. So what I'll do is I'll take snaps of each different version of the paragraph and send you them.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah,
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
It was also it was printed in a role-playing game magazine, Adventurer or Imagine or something like that in the 80s as well.
Good grief.
Yeah, it's just rereading The Eternal Champion was a really interesting experience. But yeah, that one was a really good indicator, because again, when we covered, I think, The Dreaming City, Loz was reading a version published in the 70s and I was reading a version published in the late 60s, and again there were subtle differences. So every time he's kind of revised his Elric line, he's made subtle changes to kind of fit them into everything else. So it's just part of his deal, and it makes it all the more interesting and all the more exciting to get to get a new version. And you know, when you go down the rabbit hole, you end up with 4 or 5 different editions of books just because you like the different covers. There's also that nice little prompt to actually read them, just in case there's a surprise in there. Warlord of the Air is another one. I got Warlord of the Air, the Ace Pocketbooks edition from the late 60s off Pops, and then I got a version in the 80s as a Grafton omnibus. And key characters in the first 60 pages of that are completely different. Good
grief.
Yeah.
It's funny, I was thinking about this last night. You're saying about the revisions and going through stuff. I'm almost tempted to say he's like a remixer, you know. In music terms, you'd remix somebody else's track or remix your own, do different versions of it. He's almost doing that with his own stories, his own books, changing context of things. Or he's now older and he go, oh, I don't like that aspect of it, or I want to make this more maybe anti-colonial in this, you know, with Warlord of the Air. My politics have evolved, my views of the world have evolved, I'm less sexist or whatever. So these all kind of get rolled in, and like you say, it becomes a subtly different animal as you go along. You just assume one from 30 years ago is the same book, but it clearly isn't.
Well, one of my big loves for Moorcock is the fact that even in the 60s, even in the original and revised texts, he was really, really, I don't know if left-wing is the right description, but he was anti-colonial, anti-war, anti-tyranny. Is the final program is just absolutely staggering when you read a late 60s edition of that and think, you know, how on earth did people take it at the time? And I suppose he got away with it because it was science fiction. So nobody was going to kick the doors down, because his main protagonist was, in the first couple of pages, revealed to be bisexual, but with no lascivious or critical or judgmental angle on it. He just was. You know, and later on, there's all sorts of conversations about you know, people of different sexualities being the future. It's just incredible stuff. And the stuff in the Warlord of the Air that he changed, funnily enough, was, and I can't remember which way around it was, but there's a scout leader on the airship in the first 40 or 50 pages who was just a massive prick. And in one version, it's Ronald Reagan. It's alternate universe, Ronald Reagan. But in the other version, it isn't. He's changed it. And I thought
you were going to say Baden-Powell for a moment, because I was reading some stuff about Baden-Powell a couple of years ago, and Jesus Christ, how he was even allowed around children is
phenomenal, isn't it? I think it was Baden-Powell whose hobby was watching executions in Africa.
He's I think it's fair enough to call him a monster, isn't it? Do that now.
So this character in Warlord of the Air is a Baden-Powell type, but I'm guessing it must be the Grafton collection from the 80s I've got, where he turns him into Ronald Reagan, because in the late 60s he was still an actor, so it wouldn't have made any sense.
Totally. He talks in a lot of his books, especially perhaps the older ones, where they talk about the stuff of chaos, you know, where you meet the chaos gods or whatever, and there's this malleability of matter, colors swirl and blob around like you're inside a lava lamp and all that stuff. But that almost kind of defines his fiction. What in looking about his stories are elastic, they're malleable. That story is different to how it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The characters morph, change within a story or within different versions of the books. I really like that. I'm not sure. Is there any other writers that have so drastically revised their work?
No, not that I'm aware of, and I don't think there are any other writers who've gone so hell for leather to really kind of almost examine their own oeuvre,
Yeah,
for want of a better expression, and just reinvent it. And I'm not massively bought into some of the stuff he did in the 80s and 90s and 2000s with the Elric character. It'll be interesting to get back to reading him again for the first time as we progress through this podcast. At this rate, probably in about 2034. But it's like the Between the Wars books that he wrote between the 80s and 90s, and I think there was a big gap in the last one. He takes Colonel Pyatt and Mrs. Cornelius and throws them into like a massive study of the history of the 20th century with various figures, and Colonel Pyatt, who was just a bit part player in the Jerry Cornelius novels, ends up becoming this unreliable narrator across these 4 sprawling books that look at the history of the 20th century. There's nobody else who does anything like that.
No, it seems a really kind of counterintuitive move to make. One decade he's bashing out kind of late era pulp, newsstand fiction. It's very much on the zeitgeist. It's very zappy. It's very now. It's very modern, very postmodern. All this breakdown of character and plot and all this. Then the next second, well, not the next second, but he evolves off into, like you say, these doorstep books, that are fascinated with history and reinvent. Well, I suppose that's a remix as well, isn't it? He's saying, what would it have been like to have been in Paris in that year, or right, Constantinople that year, but an imaginary one. There's enough reference points to anchor it to our world, but as you say, through the eyes of a unreliable narrator. But I can now remix reality. Is that what he's kind of doing there? Here's another, if the world's a jewel with different facets on it, I'm going to look at a different facet of it and maybe to amplify that and turn that into a different thing. I remember reading one of those. I went on holiday with my now wife. We were in Greece and took one of these, like I said, they're walloping great things. But I forget which one it was, but I think Pyatt gradually becomes more and more addicted to cocaine as it goes along. So it becomes more and more insane and ranty, anti-Semitic as well. I think it was leading up to sort of the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. The amazing thing about it now, talking, that was 20 years ago I read that, talking to you about that, there's a weird prophetic parallel between then and now. I'm now thinking of, coke-addled celebrities, fake news, the cult of Trump and the alt-right, conspiracy theories. It feels like he's almost preemptively going towards conspiracy theory culture.
It's funny you say that. The other day, I picked up another copy of The Laughter of Carthage, simply because it had a cover that I'd never seen before. For the benefit of people listening, I'll pop a picture of this on the blog post.
Right. Oh, yes. Oh, my God.
If that isn't current,
yeah.
It's absolutely incredible. And it's just what I keep finding every time I go back and read something by him. I'm just like, this is ridiculous. This book is 50 odd years old in some cases. They're older than me, a lot of them, and reading them, they're just as fresh and progressive, and they feel as progressive, because I think fantasy fiction, I don't read that many modern fantasy novels because I think they've got so stuffed and bloated and a little bit staid. There are interesting ideas and interesting concepts, but I don't know, nothing really grabs me about modern fantasy. So
I have to agree with you there. I mean, that's an unfair thing to say, and probably there'll be a lot of people listening to this going, But what about my favourite author? And it's
Yeah.
it's cool. There's enough for everybody.
Of course there is.
But I think generally with you, I kind of almost hate to get stuck on things like this, you know, because it feels like you're looking at the past through nostalgic optics, rose-tinted lens, that kind of thing. Oh, you know, that was my era and I don't really like any new stuff.
Yeah.
That's not strictly true. But I do find his work particularly rich, you know, and as we're saying, it does seem to be oddly prophetic in some ways. And I don't really find that with a lot of modern authors. I love China Melville. I think, you know, his stuff's fabulous. Again, I love the politics of what he does, and he's also part of that circle, isn't he? With Moorcock and Alan Moore and Steve Aylett.
I love Steve Aylett.
He's fantastic. I think absolutely wonderful. I think he's. I wish more people would read his stuff. He's wonderful. I'm not sort of big on humor books. This sounds terrible, but a lot of stuff just doesn't make me laugh. I think when I'm told to laugh, oh, this book's funny, it'll make you laugh. It kind of doesn't. His stuff is one of the few things where I've just laughed out loud virtually on every page. But again, the satire and it just it finds its target.
Yeah. Funny enough, Steve Aylett did an At the End of Time book.
Yes, he did, which I've never read. I
picked it up a while back, but I still haven't got around to reading it. My favourite Steve Aylett book, the name escaped me. It's the one about the fictional author.
Oh, Lint, Jeff Lint.
Yeah, I picked Lint up from a second-hand bookshop in London years ago and read it on the train home, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was brilliant.
It is utterly great. I got some Lint badges. He sent me some badges. So I've got a Lint badge here somewhere. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, those guys, you can see why they form a vague, they're all different, but they form a vague formation in terms of politics, satire. There's layers to their work. I don't know, but it's sort of Mike Moorcock, I guess, is the godfather, the granddaddies, the you know, those guys are sort of not in his wake. I don't mean it that way. They're all great writers, but I can see how they've kind of bundled together as a loose, coherent collective of people, you know.
Yeah.
I must admit, you know, I really like all their stuff. China's stuff, I think, is fantastic. He's one of the few sort of guys, I guess, working in fantasy loosely whose stuff very rarely disappoints me. It's always bundled thick with ideas and political undertones and satires, and it's just the ideas in there are great. The language is great. Even his kids' books are just terrific, I think. But
Moorcock was always one of those guys, wasn't he? Who always had a kind of a community of writers around him.
Yeah.
And when you talk about remixing, he allowed people to remix Jerry Cornelius in the 60s and 70s. So M. John Harrison, Brian Aldiss, and people like that wrote Jerry Cornelius short stories. But, you know, to some degree, he was responsible for getting Philip K. Dick in print in the UK in the 60s because he nurtured what he liked, which I think is such a fabulous quality. That he would look around him. He would get writers published in New Worlds. He would talk to publishers and have a word in their ear to get them a break. And he always had this kind of community of people around him. And it's similar, I suppose, with the music, that community with Hawkwind. And I hate to be a heretic, but I think when it comes down to some of the songs that he's been involved in, I think I probably fall a little bit on the Blue Oyster Cult side, just because of Veteran of the Psychic Wars, which is probably my favourite track co-written or involved with Moorcock. But it's kind of always had that around him, which is it makes him seem like a really warm, generous person, and that makes him more appealing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a social aspect to what he does or did with New Worlds, etc. So I'm kind of not surprised he's got this loose affiliation with guys now. He's always had an eye, I think, on what's floating around, who's floating around, who to keep an eye on, but without copying.
Yeah,
you know, I've never seen him as a, a stylist. But I guess if you had him on here now, he'd interrupt and say, well, at a bollocks, I love love Chesterton, I loved, X, Y, and Z. Of course he does, but that's before my time.
Yeah.
I see him very much, I guess, as a postmodernist writer, I suppose, because he really came into his own in the 70s, and we're talking about remixing and fluidity, the idea of unreliable narrators, that the author is not the perceived font of knowledge, like, you write a book and I'm going to tell you something really important here. This is my big view of the world, and you as the reader will either understand that or not. If you don't, bugger off. That kind of Ayn Rand sort of thing. Here is my worldview. Moorcock's very, like you say, there's a lot of humanity in it, and there's warmth. There's a sense of community in there, social aspects to it. He's always critiquing stuff. His characters are looking at the world through a sour, sardonic eye, or even his villains have got something useful to say about how they became what they became, how they became a villain, why they're bourgeois. He writes with sympathy, I think, even for his bad guys to a degree. So speaks a lot of his own humanity, I think.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and he's also not afraid at all of having his hero, his protagonist, as a two-dimensional monster, and the supposed antagonists being more in depth, and actually turning things around to a degree. So sometimes his eternal champion characters are just a cipher, really.
Or an arsehole.
Yeah.
You kind of think, wait a minute, this is the protagonist. I'm not really.
That's right. Yeah.
Really?
Or an out-and-out fascist dickhead.
Yeah.
Like in the case of Ericos. So of course, Moorcock has made decent forays into the world of comics as well, hasn't he? Not only being adapted by other people like Roy Thomas and P. Craig Russell and people like that, but actually writing his own series, like the multiverse comics, and collaborating with Walter Simonson and the name's
John Ridgway, I think.
John Ridgway, of course. Yeah, John Ridgway. And what do you make number one of his comics output, but number two, how he was adapted in the 70s by the likes of Marvel and people like that?
I can see sort of that Roy Thomas being the big Robert E. Howard fan, etc. I guess you could say Roy Thomas probably popularized Conan, didn't he, in a major way, almost single-handedly. Roy was still a relatively young guy at the time. I think Roy Thomas was 80 last week.
Really?
So he's the same generation as Mike, isn't he? So he would have been very aware, I guess, of the Elric stuff and what were they called? The Saga Group? Lynn Carter and co.
Right. Yeah.
Is it I can't remember. Yeah. I can't remember what Saga stands for. One of the S's is sword and sorcery. Sword and sorcery. That bunch. So Roy Thomas would have been aware of those guys, I guess, the Flashing Swords anthologies and all those sorts of things. So I suppose it's not a huge leap and a jump to sort of say, can we use Elric in a Conan story, with a fellow Brit, Barry Smith, drawing it? I'm not sure what year that would have been, 71, 72, somewhere.
One of the most wonderful stories about that is that Barry Windsor Smith didn't have a frame of reference for Elric, so somebody gave him the late 60s Ace pocketbook edition with a cover by Jack. I can't remember, but it's Elric with a pointy hat.
Hence the pointed hat.
Hence the red pointed hat and the kinky boots.
Pixie hat.
And the green coat. Yeah. Because that was the only frame of reference he had, was the 60s pocketbook edition of Stormbringer. And
looking like he escaped from a Gone album cover. Pothead Pixie there.
Yeah.
But it does kind of work. Barry Smith did get that kind of slightly fragile, elegantly wasted old Beano, the cipher for Smackhead cipher, isn't it, really?
Yeah,
thin, pale, guy has to take his meds before he can get into a sword fight, that sort of thing. I mean, I loved that run on Conan, Barry Smith, the early John Buscema stuff. Fantastic stuff. I mean, really, really great. You're mentioning the latest sort of multiverse stuff. Now, I haven't read those in years, and I've only got 2 or 3 issues of that floating around here somewhere, and I must find them and dig them out. But I'm a big Walt Simonson fan. I love his stuff. He channels Jack Kirby and Philippe Douillet, I think, in my estimation, the French artist, contemporary with Mobius. He's got that great drama of Kirby about him, but does these wonderful, strange, almost Lovecraft-esque cities and monoliths and things. So he was a great match, I think, for Moorcock. You know, he brought a bit of element of cosmic horror and grandeur to it. And I remember John Ridgway, but I can't remember what John Ridgway did. Did he do the albino detective stuff?
He did in the multiverse comic. It was Elric in the Middle Ages.
Ah, right. Yeah, I was thinking he was doing the Victorian Edwardian detective thing.
The Monsieur Zenith stuff.
That's it. Yeah.
I'd have to dig them out and see who the artist was on that. But funnily enough, on the subject of Walt Simonson, one of our friends on Twitter, Anthony Piconti, pointed out a few days ago that Moorcock and Walt Simonson almost did a Shazam run.
Really?
Yeah. Amazing what you learn from people you talk to on Twitter. Yeah.
That's kind of nuts. I can't even imagine how that would read, what that would be like.
Yeah.
You know, I love what both of those guys doing. So as a writer myself, I'm trying to in my head see, you know, what a Walt Simonson Captain Marvel, DC Captain Marvel Shazam would look like.
Yeah. How
Moorcock would write it. Okay, I might have to later go and have a lie down and see if I figured that out. Because you always think of, you know, Shazam, Captain Marvel being that soft, rounded, C.C. Beck, Fawcett Comics thing. You know, there's very everything's circular, soft, marshmallowy physique. That's the Captain Marvel of my era, my generation. Obviously, these days he's not drawn like that. Whereas Walt Simonson's art's very angular, blocky blacks. So I'm kind of like going, what would that look like? You know, and trying to imagine how Moorcock would dialogue it. Sorry, I'm just going off on a fanboy thing there, because I just kind of, in my head, I'm thinking, wow, that's a great might have been.
Yeah.
I just got to get a thing in about John Ridgway while I'm here, you know, as a advert. I love John Ridgway's stuff. I mean, in the UK, I think he's appreciated amongst Brit comic book fans. Probably not as widely known as he should be. He's somebody I would dearly love to work with. So if John Ridgway is not going to be listening to this, but if somebody knows him, 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, I'd love to do something with John Ridgway. I don't think he's retired. I could be wrong, but I don't know. He's somebody.
I'm very out of touch with 2000 AD. Is Luke Kirby still a thing, or is that a thing?
Oh God, no. It got reprinted a couple of years ago. That was written by Alan McKenzie, who was the Tharg that got me into the business in the early 90s. I really liked Alan. He's still out there doing bits and pieces. He was a really good guy. He's a really great editor who kind of taught me the basics of doing pro work. He wrote Luke Kirby with John, so we're talking, I guess, around about that period, 94, 95, 96.
Yeah.
Alan left Egmont Fleetway as it was at the time. I think may have even been fired. It's taken a long time for Luke Kirby to get reprinted, and it's got a lot of love in the last year or two, because people are kind of saying, my God, this is like a proto Harry Potter, but way better.
Yeah.
You know, it's got that naturalistic feel to it. John's got, I don't mean in a derogatory way, he's got a very scratchy, almost sketchy way of drawing, and I absolutely adore it.
Yeah.
And the boy magician Luke Kirby, I love the way he draws it. It does feel like one of those wonderful kind of rite of passage boyhood stories from a 50s or 60s annual, but it's got a little bit more, it's more knowing, you know. It's great.
Yeah, I think John Ridgway arrived for me in the Dead Man strip.
Oh yes,
the Post-Necropolis thing for Judge Dredd, where you had a simultaneous run. You had Will Simpson drawing Judge Dredd at the time, and then you had that kind of concurrent run of John Ridgway doing the Dead Man, and then because of his art style was so non-sci-fi and so what you think to be antithetical to classic Judge Dredd, that's what made the climax and the shock work so brilliantly. I remember reading that and the penny drops that the Dead Man in John Ridgway's art is Dredd, and it was absolutely mind-blowing. I think that was one of the few instances I can remember in comics where I had a mind-blown epiphany in the same way that I've had reading a Moorcock book and making a connection between two characters 15 years apart or something like that. You know, it was absolutely incredible. I love his art. It's wonderful.
It's an inspired choice of artist, you know. I don't know how else to describe it. It kind of grounds it, and as you say, it throws the viewer off course, you know, because you just don't associate that look or that feel with Dredd at all, you know.
Yeah,
it's kind of grubby and dirty, and grubby bandages.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you know, how would you feel about adapting as a comics writer and a writer? How would you feel about adapting Moorcock?
Jeez.
Is that a gig you'd go for?
I'm not sure that he's a huge fan of people. I could be wrong, doing stuff, you know, adapting, working with. No, actually, that's contradicting what we're saying earlier, isn't it? Where Jerry Cornelius was given over to remixing. You know, Jerry Cornelius is a process. Yeah. I think it's something I probably spend a couple of days going, geez, where do I start? You'd be kind of slightly in awe of it, or I wouldn't even go near it without his blessing, you know, and I'd take a long run up to it, I think. Yeah.
He's very much, he's still in that space where he's very much celebrating other people's adaptations. A few years ago, a French writer and a French artist adapted Elric of Melniboné, and Volume 1's called The Ruby Throne, and it's absolutely beautiful artwork. I'm not overly taken on the adaptation and the Elric character, but the artwork is completely beautiful. It's stunning. But Moorcock himself said that if he'd rewritten those books again back in the day, he would have adapted some of the changes that they made, and he thinks it's the best adaptation that there's ever been.
Well, that's a very cool and generous aspect, isn't it? I mean, I would be just now thinking about, well, I'm not really sure where I'd go. I mean, I believe there's a bit of a beef with Grant Morrison going on, you know, or there was in recent years. Yeah. So I did wonder whether he was uncomfortable with some comic book work that mined him, but perhaps the difference is, don't borrow from me, don't plagiarize, but if you ask me and you're respectful, it's okay. I guess that's the difference. I don't know.
Yeah, I think perhaps if someone like Grant Morrison had said, you know, I'd really, really love to do a take on Jerry Cornelius, he probably would have said, yeah, great, go for it. But he didn't. He did Gideon Stargrave. And I think that's because I think Grant Morrison's had a beef with Alan Moore as well, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there just seems to be something around certain creatives who just get into beefs with people, I guess. I don't know enough about Grant Morrison to really have an opinion. I think I read Arkham. Did he do Arkham Asylum back in the day with the Bill Sienkiewicz artwork, which I thought was really, really good? But I don't really
Dave McCain, I think. McCain.
Yeah, I don't really know that much about Grant Morrison's work.
He's somebody
what he did in 2000 AD, of course, back in the day.
I used to read a lot of his stuff back in the day, but weirdly, Arkham Asylum is one of the most famous ones. I've never read it.
Yeah, it's a triumph more of mood and style, and beautiful artwork. It came out round about that time where graphic novels as just works of beautiful painted artwork suddenly became a thing. We take it for granted now. Just look at the work on Fall of Dead World. That was something like that in the 80s was like a massive prestige thing in comics, whereas now you've got people like Dave just throwing this beautiful stuff out at a rate, I don't know if it's a rate of knots, but there's so much of this beautiful artwork in comics now. We're absolutely spoiled.
Dave may disagree with me, but he is, in my view, he's a fabulous artist, great guy as well, but he is, in my view, pretty quick. He may go, no, I'm not, do you realize I spend 18 hours a day? But I mean, an episode of that, when we're on deadlines for stuff, Dave will turn an episode around in a fortnight. Wow. So week one would be pencils, and then about a week later the painted artwork turns up in my inbox. Everybody sees the end product, which is gorgeous. I'm lucky enough to see the pencils, the midway stage.
Yeah.
And Dave's pencils are really great. There's a lot of kinetics in his work. There's a lot of movement, life, vibrancy. I think with some painted artwork, I'm not talking about Dave here, but because of the density of the color and the way sometimes the printing's not always, sympathetic. Yeah. Some painted work can feel very, very static, like a series of paintings, basically. But Dave's doesn't, I don't think. But his pencils, there's a lot of life in them, and it's almost a shame. I think people don't see his penciled stuff. There's, I don't know. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Glenn Faby a few years ago. It's got a sinewness. Yeah. Is that even a word to it? Muscularity, but not. Yeah. Things do seem to be in motion. And sorry, I'm doing all sorts of miming here that you can't see, like doing a weird Marcel Marceau sort of, dopamine swirl thing. Dave's got that. There's curves in it and motion.
Yeah.
I'm really over-egging this, aren't you? You can tell I'm a writer. So it's almost, would love people sometimes. Dave would go, no, I don't want people to see my pencils. That's me working out, solving problems, Yeah. But I think his pencils are really handsome, and it's always lovely when I get they come in, for the editor to sign off. You're happy with how we've laid this out, and I was kind of lean back in my chair a bit and go, ooh, I can see what's coming, And then about a week later, you get this beautifully rendered, coloured stuff. So yeah, long way round the block there. Dave's pretty fast, I think, in my opinion. Given the quality of his work, it's very, very sumptuous, and his colour choices are amazing. But his pencils are great. People just don't get to see that, I don't think.
No, for everybody who's listening, check out the Fall of Dead World volumes for Kek's work and Dave's artwork. It really is staggeringly beautiful in a deeply disturbing way. Now, what really struck me about that artwork was when I was a kid, and I remember this was at Nana and Pops's house in the 70s. My uncle got the War of the Worlds Jeff Wayne album for the first time, and with a booklet. And it terrified me when I was 6 or 7 years old, because I remember looking at the cover. The cover terrified me for a start. But reading through, there's a picture of the red weed all over like some ruined houses, and it has that glistening, disturbing, melted flesh kind of quality. And what I love about Dave's work in Fall of Dead World is I have those racket feelings related to being absolutely appalled and terrified as a 7-year-old, and it brings them back to mind. But I'm now old enough to not be kind of repulsed by it or terrified by it. I can appreciate how beautiful the artwork is, just how he manages to inject the black comedy into elements of it whilst it being in many ways beautifully repulsive, if that's the right way of describing it.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, what you just described there, I think that kind of sums up his work. And there's this wonderful, I don't know, like melding of the organic and the inorganic. So you've got bones and flesh and skin.
Yeah.
And you put it against rubble and buildings, and there's this point at which they almost seem to fuse. And the humans and the dark judges are like a blight, a fungal infection on the landscape that they're on, aren't they? And the buildings almost feel that there's rust and rot, and that feels like even the buildings are diseased. Flaking paint, scabbings, I love all this stuff. So I mean, it's always a joy to see that when it comes in. And Dave spends a lot of time, I think, as well, thinking about color choices for individual episodes. If there's a certain emotional mood to it, obviously the different stories have different tones. He spends quite a bit of time thinking about, how best to reflect that. Does this feel like it should have a documentary feel, or does this feel like you were saying earlier, like that War of the Worlds thing? Maybe I'll go for something. I mean, I've got a term for one of the things he does. I call it rust punk. Sort of say, oh, can we go rust punk on this? So that one might mean an oil refinery or warehouses or scaffolding falling down. As versus a sort of brickwork or concrete with weeds coming through it. That kind of feel.
I think that's why it works so beautifully, because many people have tried to take on the Dark Judges, but I think too many people have been too what's the word? They've honoured Bolland's cleanness too much.
Yeah.
And to really make the Dark Judges something more and something different and worth doing visually, you've got to do something different than just try and recreate Bolland in a slightly different art style. And Dave's done it in spades.
Yeah, totally. And the colour palette obviously adds another layer to it. I'm going back to something you said just now about the black humour. I mean, that's been deliberate fairly, right from the beginning, because it just struck me really, if you're going to do this stuff, you got to be careful it isn't just a series of atrocities. We just came through a period in horror films. I mean, you and I are a little bit older. We probably enjoy the kind of splatter aesthetics of late 70s, early 80s, golden age stuff. But we've just come out the period of, I suppose you call it like torture porn, Saw movies, Hostel, that stuff. With the Dark Judges, you've got to lighten it with some humour, humanity, hope, that sort of thing. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just a series of them. It's them wandering around doing the most repulsive, repellent things imaginable. And what the hell is the point of that? It's just a series of atrocities. There's no lesson to be learnt. There's no moral. There's no philosophy. So tried to kind of bring humour to it and humanity. Generally see things from the street view, as it were, from the little people in the story. So initially it was deliberate to not have the Dark Judges in it that often, because again, you can amplify the horror. Because imagine if they were real, sorry, this sounds really stupid, but if they existed in our world, it's just how uncanny and weird it would be. So I kind of tried to look at it from that point of view, from our point of view, from the victim's point of view. Yeah. And also build, narratives into it of humanity and unlikely heroism and hope, Yeah. People say, oh, we all know how this story ends. And it's kind of, well, maybe you don't. But part of it is as well, let's talk about what it sounds like a cliche, what it means to be human. Yeah. But have the Dark Judges as the backdrop to that, perhaps. And show how kind of they amplify our own failings as well, rather than let's have 60 pages of genocide. It's like, geez, Christ.
Yeah,
that would make me want to weep.
The eternal champion, wouldn't you?
Yeah, completely.
Because that's basically what that would be. Well, if you did ever get into the realms of Moorcock adaptation, Clint Langley is a massive Elric fan.
Wow.
He's an Elric super fan.
I certainly, when I first did the first Dark Judges thing, I remember writing the first one and just going, holy shit, and bricking yourself because this is iconic territory.
Yeah.
After you did the first one, it kind of things start slotting into place and you get a measure of it. And going back to Moorcock earlier, I think if I was lucky enough to be able to do an adaptation or play in that sandpit, I think it might be a similar thing, really. The first few pages, you'd be thinking, jeez, go outside, take a deep breath and come back in, because 12-year-old me obviously would be massively thrilled. I'm a fanboy, what can I say?
Yeah.
But I'd want to bring something new to it as well.
Yeah. And that's the wonderful thing about doing this podcast is I get to talk to other fanboys, which is, we never run out of things to say. But you know what? Thanks for joining me in virtual Derry and Tom's. Maybe one day it'd be lovely if we could go to the real Derry and Tom's.
Yeah.
Maybe even do the Rituals of Infinity like we originally planned. Let's see what happens time wise. But thanks ever so much for coming on. It's been brilliant. It's been really great to pick your brains, and maybe we'll see you on the show again.
Yeah. Cheers. Take care. See you soon.
The unstable matter situation was confined in a rough radius of 10 miles. Here there was no grey ash, but boiling colour and an ear-shattering, unearthly noise. Falstaff found it hard to adjust his eyes and ears to the UMS. He was familiar with the sight and sound of disrupted, unstable matter, but he never got used to it. Great spiralling gouts of stuff would twist hundreds of feet into the air and then fall back again. The sounds were almost indescribable, like the roar of 1,000 tidal waves, the screech of vast sheets of metal being tortured and twisted, the rumble of gigantic landslides. Around the perimeter of this terrifying example of nature's death throes, there buzzed landcraft and helicopters. A big adjuster could be seen trained on the UMS, the men and machines completely dwarfed by the swirling fury of the unstable elements.
Thanks to KEK-W for being a great co-host on this show. It really was a treat for me to have an alumni of the galaxy's greatest comic join me to chew the fat over all things Moorcock. We tried to hook up a year or so ago, but after a few false starts the plague happened and I let things slip. So I'm really grateful to Kek for being game for another try. Now, before we proceed further, I want to give a big shout out to our Jugadero, Alex. Alex dropped us a line to say, "I'm glad to support you in this podcast. It's really refreshing to see a podcast like this and it's made me dig into my Moorcock collection again. I'd say my first introduction was Dorian Hawkmoon, but it was really Jerry Cornelius who caught my imagination. I love the fact he was an out-and-out bisexual, enjoyed his life, but was still a bastard at heart, really. The final programme was seared into early memory, and how he interacted with everyone, including Miss Brunner. I think it branded in my mind the sheer and utter chaos, along with the lack of fluidity in law, and how the two could clash. And then you have this champion who has to balance the two. Good and evil, not as interesting. I've been listening to your final programme episodes again recently, and in the second part I'd like to correct one thing. You mentioned at the start about transgenderism, and the rows over on Twitter. To add my input, transgenderism is a term that somewhat bugs me. It's often used very negatively by those opposed to transgender folks simply trying to live their lives. I'm one of them, and while it's amusing to see how far these people will go to try and see the transgender agenda, the truth is, we don't have one. Our agenda, if any, is simply let us be. That is why J.K. Rowling is such a conflicting person, and her doubling down hasn't helped. I appreciate that you didn't go into anything negative yourself, and I'll continue to support your efforts, as it's very entertaining. But I thought I'd correct your use of that word, as it's not a pleasant word to be hearing. Thanks for hearing me out. Alex, I'm really grateful to you for letting us know how our words made you feel. At the end of the day, we're largely a bunch of old duffers talking on the fly, and sometimes we're not close enough to the detail of a thing to realise that language we may naively think of as innocuous may be hurtful to others. Thanks for talking to us, letting us know, and thanks for your ongoing support. We also have a new patron to thank, Robert. We had a quick natter, and Robert said, "My mother is from Hamburg, Germany. She and her older sister came to the USA in 1958. My Aunt Isa returned to Germany in the early 1980s with her 3 children. The oldest, Mark, 3 years my elder, he learned German and how to be an AD&D dungeon master at the same time. He was a big reader of all kinds of books, fantasy included. In 1987, my mother sent me to stay with them for the summer in the university town of Tübingen, near Stuttgart. I had plenty to do there, had my first kiss, travelled here and there and everywhere in the country, but I had plenty of time to read. I took a few bites of books that were out of my league at the time. War and Peace, Vanity Fair, John le Carré's A Perfect Spy, all 3 of those remain favourites these many years later, and The Nomad of Time, an omnibus edition of the Oswald Bastable books. The setting, British India, intrigued me, coming from a home where we spent time watching The Far Pavilions and The Jewel in the Crown, among other series broadcast on public television in the USA and courtesy of British production houses, Thames, Yorkshire TV, BBC, ITV, even Channel 4 perhaps. Doctor Who was and remains my favourite. My cousin Mark also had a copy of the 3 Coram novels, though I can't remember if they were the Swords set or the Item plus Animal second set. Anyway, I picked up the Nomad book, began reading and could not put it down. When I returned to the USA, I looked at Moorcock's name and discovered an edition of the first 4 Cornelius novels. Again, these were way over my head, but I dug in. My goodness, they blew my mind. I even felt sort of cool because of the swinging London setting and the total abandonment of typical narrative structure by the time we hit the second book. A year later, I went to Britain on a school trip, starting in London and ending in Glasgow. I perhaps unwisely stuffed my duffel with books I couldn't find in the States. Boy, they were heavy, and chief among them were the brass Hawkmoon stories, The City in the Autumn Stars, The Brothel in Rosenstrasse, The Dancers at the End of Time. Lucky young fellow I. Back in America, I kept scouting the stores and came up with copies of the 3 Eternal Champion novels, the D.A.W. Elric series, Behold the Man, the 2nd and 3rd Cornelius connections, Breakfast in the Ruins, Gloriana, Mother London, and more. I later picked up The Chinese Agent, King of the City, a gift from an ex-girlfriend, and so on. I was thoroughly pleased with Moorcock's willingness to pursue just about any genre or style of fiction, to go at it with a certain faith mixed with subversion, and irony mixed with sincerity. That appreciation continues to grow in me. Thanks again for the wonderful show, and regards to Phil and the rest of the crew. Thank you, Robert, for your support. I love that we all have that one thing in common, the fervent, gotta-catch-em-all plunge down the Moorcock rabbit hole. It's time now to thank our Chaos Engineers, hard at work in the belly of the ship. Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Van Ness, Fred, Dave, Jim, John Watt, Nelbert, Simon Perrins, Robbo, Malpertwee, and Ben. You may have seen from our Twitter account that Jim has launched his project, Urish's Hoard, the Guide to Elric Collectibles, on Kickstarter. Available as print and PDF, it features input from a wide range of luminaries including Rob Weir of Tigers of Pantang, Alan Davey of Hawkwind, and cover artist extremo Robert Gould. I'll link to the Kickstarter in the blog post. Please do check it out and support Jim's work. And to our Jugaderos over at the Town Hall Cafe, working to gain that winning hand. Clarky, Craig, Loz, Matthew, Randall, Steve, Tom, Ian, and Alex. And of course, to our patron demons. Master Paconti, supporter extraordinaire. On the recommendation of Brute of Lashmar, he's found a couple of Danish books in the Don Blas's library. I wonder what he made of them. To Lord Norman, Baker on the Rocks. Those Wuzzo birds are leading a merry dance and causing literal chaos as they argue between themselves about the correct pronunciation of a certain flowery treat, and also which order to apply the jam and cream. And to the Lapsed Gamer, he's training up a brand new Darzi hunting dog, the militant ranks of the Sufus Prime, closers of the landlord's gates, will rue the day. And to Dreadmort Main, currently caged in a cage of her own making, called Cage.
I need you to get me out of this.
And Sir Neil of Burton, the Destiny Knight, currently mind-bonding with the brain trees of Theta 4. And last but not least, of course, to Robert, whose visage is not yet clear to me. I sense something in the midst of that miasma. It's taking shape. Right, that's about it from me for now. Stay tuned for Chapter 7 of the Journal of Gerard Arthur Connelly after the transition. But before I go, don't forget you can follow and gab with us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The blog is at breakfastintheruins.com. We have our Patreon page too. We're out there on most podcatchers. If you have a favourite and we're not on it, drop me a line and I'll see what I can do about it. But stay safe, and I'll see you soon on the Moonbeam Roads. The Journal of Gerard Arthur Connelly, Chapter 7, An Effective Defence. We did a mighty job of clearing the table between us, but afterwards no more wine was forthcoming, and, after policing the remains of the meal, Sebastian and Carl retired, leaving us sitting by the enormous fire. The black iron surround emanated heat in a continuous wave, and with my full belly and sore feet I tired quickly. There was no talking to Morton, he was grumbling and preoccupied. Vincent and Friedrich were talking revenge and how best to serve it. I decided I needed to take a walk to clear my head. Outside of the keep, the wind had dropped, leaving the night air heavy with moisture. It settled immediately on my face and clothes and ran into my mouth. It tasted bitter and of decay. I regretted leaving my cap in the bedchamber, but felt comforted by the heavy weight of my familiar sidearm. The Webley Mark 9 service revolver had stayed with me throughout my travels, and fortunately I had seldom been forced to draw it. Although a thing of cold, starkly designed beauty, it is not a subtle weapon, and as a demonstration of power, it could draw precisely the wrong sort of attention were I to wave it about willy-nilly. Besides, the day I met Hildebrand, I was not tooled for an expedition, and the 6 bullets the revolver carried had now become 2. I still carried the empty cartridges in a soft velvet bag in the hope that I should find a way to reuse them, but the opportunity had never arisen. Reassured, I took a heavy brass lantern from its hook by the door, carefully adjusted the wick so as not to attract too much attention to myself, and picked my footsteps carefully around the wall towards the outhouses. I was wearing my faithful slippers on my feet as, caked in salve as they were, I did not wish to damage the soft leather inners of my boots. Sadly, each stone and uneven rock I stepped upon aggravated my sore feet through the insubstantial rubber soles, and soon the tartan was sodden with moisture. The nature of the dense night air seemed to change as I passed through it. It took on an almost tangible consistency, and I felt as if I were powering my way through it, much like an ironclad ship would cleave through a heavy brine. The analogy pleased me, and gifted me the much-needed confidence to press on. Clutching my sidearm tightly, I made for the outhouses, steering a course from memory, as visibility was poor and deteriorating further by the second. I fancied that I glimpsed indistinct shapes slipping through eddies in the fog, and heard the faint creaking of timbers and clatter of wheels on stone, and over it a wheezing sound like that of a great diseased pair of lungs struggling to suck breath from the air. My resolve was close to breaking when a lumpen silhouette loomed over me in the gloom. I choked back a cry and stood rooted in fear. The shape did not move, and momentarily I realised that, though it felt to have taken an age, I had crossed the 20 or so feet from the portico and reached my destination. The first of the buildings was an extensive set of stables. A dozen horses were adequately quartered beneath its shingles. I was greeted by nervous whinnies as I made my way down the row of stalls to the stock at the far end. An adjoining stone hut served as a tack room. It was piled high with barding of a familiar design, pearlescent black and ochre, fashioned in the likeness of scales. I turned back to the stalls. 6 magnificent black horses were housed that looked to fit the finely crafted harness and tack that accompanied the heaped armour to a T. I hurried onward to the next building. The door was stiff, but I forced it open. My lantern illuminated a veritable armoury, but there was little sign of any artisan's tools. This looked like plunder, and amongst the pillage, some old and worn, some new and fashionable, were several glistening helms and breastplates. They were of the Order of the Snake. The finest example was of superior craftsmanship to the others. I surmised it to have belonged to the occupant of the richly appointed coach. Of the former occupants of the armour there was no sign, but by now my nerves were ragged and I hastened back towards the keep at speed. The hall was empty when I returned. Back in my chamber I divested myself of my soggy slippers and gingerly pulled on my boots. After packing my haversack and donning my coat and scabbard, I determined to head back to the hall and attempt to locate my companions. As I exited the bottom of the stairwell and entered the gallery, I felt a familiar sensation, although I could not pinpoint in my mind from whence the physical memory originated. An ingress in the wall appeared to be the source of some invisible emanation. It struck me that the sensation was similar in some way to proximity with the ornithopter's power source, but more closely resembled that felt when in Hildebrand's workshop. The light from the main hall penetrated only a few feet, but revealed a recessed passage that I had somehow failed to notice earlier, seeing only a plain wall. Stepping hesitantly into the opening, I saw that it ran for a dozen or so yards before curving down into gloom. A recessed door was set into the stone, halfway down on the left. Now curious, as well as concerned for my travelling companions, I made for it. The door opened freely to reveal a cavernous library-cum-study. The walls were shelved from floor to ceiling and packed tightly with volumes of all shapes, sizes, and states of decay. I was drawn to a desk at the far end, illuminated by dying embers in a stone hearth. A strange apparatus of tubes and crystal defied my attempts to fathom its function, but as my fingertips caressed a number of slight depressions on a smooth surface, the emanation ceased. I heaved the strange contraption into my haversack and returned to the dim passage. By now, my senses were becoming finely attuned to my situation. I have found many times in the past that I have an affinity for the strange and unusual, or at least my subconscious mind does, and my facility for negotiating uncommon situations belies my somewhat ordinary upbringing and civilised breeding. I determined to locate my companions and confer as to our course of action. The Count was evidently hiding a great deal and, although not a friend of the Dark Empire, may not be as philanthropic as his proffered hospitality suggested. The exposed position of the Gravenberg Keep appeared by daylight to leave it acutely vulnerable, yet I had a needling suspicion that an assault from without was the least of my concerns. The unnatural composition of the heavy dew hanging about the exterior of the keep reinforced this feeling. It was familiar,